Hello and welcome to episode 53 of Foreign Correspondence, a podcast that brings you interviews with journalists around the world. I'm Jake Spring, a foreign correspondent with more than 9 years' experience in Brazil and China. This week, I spoke to Bryan Curtis, an editor-at-large for The Ringer. Bryan hosts The Ringer's Press Box podcast and writes about sports and occasionally other things for The Ringer website. I'll leave it to him to explain what an editor-at-large is anyway. We'll discuss Bryan's extensive career, and it turns out that I had the totally wrong impression of him. He did not spring forth in the media industry as a fully formed sports journalist. He instead started doing other stuff and gradually worked his way toward sports. His career takes him to the New Republic, Slate, The Daily Beast, Grantland, a short-lived New York Times sports magazine, and probably some other things I'm forgetting. It's a truly impressive career through a lot of startup internet outfits that are now seen as mainstream big media brands. It certainly sounds like it was a lot of fun along the way. I mean, he gets to interview George Lucas at one point. His writing is also very different than many of my past guests, as to one degree or another, his jobs have all involved some level of opinion writing, or at least a strong point of view that you don't see in hard news. Then about this episode, I won't lie, if you're listening to this on Sunday, July 18th, when it's supposed to come out, it's a small miracle I've actually managed to get this episode together. I'm juggling it with a reporting trip in the Amazon rainforest that has been a bit of a scramble to pull together. If I do manage to get it out, chalk it up to Bryan being the consummate podcasting professional, and this one requiring much less editing than normal. Also, one quick fact check. I at one point slander Bryan by saying something about him contributing to a movie roundup at The Ringer. I had it wrong. I looked again at his back catalog, and it was just some other podcast he went on to talk about the sequel to Borat. Like most internet users, I failed to actually click through and see what the heck it was. Anyway, with that small errata aside, here's my interview with Bryan Curtis, an editor-at-large at The Ringer and the host of the Press Box podcast. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast, Bryan.
Thank you for having me. I'm honored that you asked.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And we'll get a little bit into why I invited you on a bit later once we talk a little bit about your biography. But to start, if you could just set the scene for us, where are you geographically and the physical space around you, and tell us a little bit about what your past week has been like work-wise.
Sure. I'm in Northwest Connecticut. I'm in a little cabin in the woods on the second floor surrounded by a whole bunch of books that I didn't remember putting in here, but I am really excited to read this summer if I have any time. I tend to buy lots and lots of used books and then sort of forget to read them. Last week, work-wise, we're in the middle of the NBA Finals, which at The Ringer is like being in the middle of a national election. So I did a very 2021 thing, which is host a podcast called The Press Box, and I had been doing this thing on the podcast all the time saying every time the media writes a story about an old person rediscovering talent we thought had dribbled away, we should call that story The Old Guy Still Got It. Mm-hmm. So Martin Scorsese makes another great movie after a little bit of a slack period. The old guy still got it. Phil Mickelson wins the PGA Championship, et cetera, et cetera. So Chris Paul made the NBA Finals at 36 years old, which is old by NBA standards. So I said, I finally have to take this bit that I've been using on the podcast over and over again and just turn it into a column. So that's been my last week work-wise.
So you wrote that up.
I did.
In addition to doing the podcast. And just to explain a little bit to our listeners, you have one of those titles that I love because I have no clue what it means. You're an editor-at-large at The Ringer, and you seem to do a little bit of everything. Could you just explain what exactly that position means?
I'm glad you don't have an idea, because I don't either, really. I love the title. I never want to lose it, but yeah, it was an old Time Life title back in the day, and I think, when they put editors out to pasture, they would call them editor at large and say, okay, you're still on the payroll, you're not really running anything, but you're editor at large. No, it sort of means, I think in a happy sense, that you have an opportunity to do lots of things, that you're self-directed a little bit, that you can, in my case, write about sports and write about politics and talk about the media and all those kinds of things. So that's how I interpret it, that it's a cool title, that sort of says, hey, Bryan's going to do lots of different kinds of things for us.
Right. You've got broad license to do things. It's almost like, a special correspondent or something for a newspaper.
Yeah, that'll be in my next life.
Sure. Okay. And so then we like to get some idea of how you got to where you are today, how you became this editor, podcaster, etc. at The Ringer. And, a lot of young journalists listen to this, and, it's about giving them kind of an idea of how people find their way to where they are. And I like to start way, way back at the beginning. If you could just tell us a little bit about where you were born, what growing up was like, and if anything planted the seeds early on for your interest in journalism.
I was born in Fort Worth, Texas, which is the other part of DFW, the FW and DFW airport. A nice, big, but not super big, and small, but not super small city. It's a really, really fabulous place, and I still love going back there. Spent my whole life there, or my whole childhood there, my whole childhood in the same house. I grew up around very sports-mad people who were very into football and baseball and basketball and everything else.
Sure.
And about second grade, and I think every sports writer has this in their biography somewhere, I just realized I was not going to be a great baseball player, no matter how much I wanted to be. My first dream was to play second base for the Texas Rangers. And I think I was really lucky that was taken off the table very, very quickly. But another funny thing was happening, Jake, at the same time, which is that I was reading the sports page every day because we were actually reading newspapers back then. This is the 80s. And well, the funny thing was happening is that I was, of course, you'd open that big, cool Sunday sports section, which was like 30 pages long. And there was a big photo of whoever the, Cowboy star of the day was above the fold. But I would find myself looking at the driver's license sized photo of the sports columnist that was next to the column. I'd be like, oh, wow, I wonder what he's like. And I was almost less interested in the actual star athlete than I was in the star reporter. And it's weird. And looking back at that, I was like, oh, I was setting myself up for a career of being in media and writing about the media, though I could not have possibly articulated that in second grade or whenever that started happening.
Sure.
So yeah, so that was really the start, and then a very conventional pre-digital existence from there. Writing for the school paper. I wrote a few stories for the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, had a kids section. This is back in the days when newspapers were fat and happy. And they sent me off to cover a few baseball award shows that were local and things like that. And I wrote them up.
This is when you're still in high school?
In middle school, I think it started. Wow. It was a pretty young thing. And then, high school, I was editor of the newspaper. I was sports editor. And I tried to make the high school sports beat as, butt kicking as was possible. I'm not sure anybody read anything I ever wrote. The only evidence I had that anybody read anything was, it was my senior year. I think this was probably the last article I ever wrote, but the baseball team that we had there at high school lost in the first round of the playoffs, and all the seniors played really badly. And I just wrote an article saying that senior leadership really let this team down. I think I quoted the coach saying the same thing. And one of the players' parents confronted me in the school parking lot and was said, you've known these kids since kindergarten. I just couldn't believe Bryan Curtis would write something like this. And that was, that was like my first moment of, oh, wow, this is what being a journalist is like. You try to tell the truth and, inevitably get everybody mad at you. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, that's a great story. So you're already doing it kind of in high school, middle school. And I have found, the other sports journalists I talked to, Tim Cato, also started when he was 15 or something like that. And it's I think sports journalism in particular might draw people early for whatever reason.
Yeah, because I think kids are commonly sports fans, right? And if you're not a good athlete, I don't want to speak for Tim, but I'm guessing he's not, Dirk Nowitzki. You kind of ask yourself, well, what do I do? How am I going to be into sports without actually playing it? And that's often the answer.
Right. So then do you go off to college and study journalism, or what happens next?
I never did because I was dissuaded. Somebody told me, a teacher, in fact, in high school told me, I heard that you don't really have to major in journalism when you get to college. That probably isn't a good idea. You should go learn other stuff. So I didn't take any journalism classes, and I just majored in political science at the University of Texas. But I wrote for the newspaper there. And that's how I got, that was sort of the next thing that I did, was essentially writing editorials for the Daily Texan at UT.
And were you doing a little bit of sports and a little bit of other stuff, or was it all on sports? Or
no, it was almost all on politics. I sort of had talked myself. It's funny because I only really wanted to be a sports writer, and then I got to college, and I guess I started thinking deeper thoughts, or trying to think deeper thoughts in a 19-year-old way. And I thought, you know what, sports writing, that doesn't seem all that important. I should be doing something more important than that. So I should be focusing on politics or world affairs or something else. So that was more my focus at that point than sports, and I sort of put it aside for a while.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. No, I mean, that makes sense to me. I mean, I was an Asian studies major and just worked at the newspaper. Like, I always looked at the journalism school and thought, do I really need 13 journalism classes or however many? And most people said no if you ask them. So yeah, I mean, and then from here, it's basically a lot of me asking, and then what happens next, and then what happens next. So what happens next after college? What
was really funny, it was actually during college. I, in a very, again, charming pre-digital way, I saw that Nightline, remember Nightline, the old ABC News show, which was still hosted by Ted Kopp at the time, had summer interns. I think I read that actually in like a bound book of like, here are some cool summer internships. Mm-hmm. So I took all my resume and everything, and I sent it away in the mail. They called me back and interviewed me a couple of times, and I got the internship somewhat improbably. And I went to Washington, D.C., and I got to spend the whole summer there.
Wow.
In the newsroom. And that was such a cool experience. And, it was Ted Koppel was off covering Kosovo and then coming back, and network news was not completely in the depleted state that it is now. It still seemed very vital and very cool. Like, there was a live show every night at midnight. Mm-hmm. And, at 12:05, and we had to be ready. And a lot of times, sometimes they would tape it in advance, but a lot of times we would stay, there'd be like a big school shooting or something, and we'd be there all night and, running tapes around to get on the air. So that was my first really, really cool experience in that regard. And then the second thing, I'll just go ahead and say what happens next, and then I'll give it back to you.
Sure.
But at the end of college, almost again the same thing. I think I actually used the internet this time, but I was looking up, okay, what I was thinking about going to journalism school, finally taking those classes, and then I looked and I saw that the New Republic magazine in Washington had interns. It paid, I think, $3,000 a month, and I thought, well, that sounds really cool. I'm really interested in politics. I've just worked at Nightline. Once again, I mailed all my clips to them. They called me in. They flew me to Washington for an interview. I seem to remember at that point I wasn't completely sure what the New Republic was all about. I think I'd read some stuff, so I remember stealing some copies of it from the UT library to put in my bag so I could make sure that I had a really good handle on the magazine by the time I got to Washington. Mm-hmm. But I got the internship, and I talked to some people, and they said, don't go to journalism school, take the job. So I did, and that was my first job.
Wow. And was that before or after what's his name, Stephen Glass?
Yeah. It was right after. So I think you're talking about a period of a couple of years. So it was a period when a time when they had maximum distrust for 22-year-olds. So it's always a great time to start at a magazine.
Yeah. No, all I know is the movie, but it is like an anxiety bomb for journalists, basically, that movie.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So did that turn into a job, or you just did an internship for a few months, or how did it go?
Yeah, it was 9 months. So it was a long time, and that was nice. And I got to write some pieces, and then near the end of it, a full-time, or it was a temporary job, but sort of not an internship, but not a forever job, opened up at Slate. And that was interesting because that was run at the time by a whole bunch of former New Republic people who had left the magazine and decided to found what was then an early online magazine. So I put myself up for that. They gave me that job, and then I wound up working there for the next 6 years.
Wow. And yeah, I mean, I'm sure to people listening now, this sounds like quite the journalism pedigree, all these names. But I mean, back then, how did was Slate still the big thing that it was now, or was it a bit different back then?
It's 2001. So it was definitely cool. It definitely had people thought very highly of it. It was just that something that was only online was still, and it seems so mind-blowing today, it was still seen as something kind of weird, I think, in a lot of people's minds. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people said, well, I don't want to go work there. You know, my articles are on a computer. What? I want to be at the New York Times. I want to be at the New Yorker. I want to be someplace like that. So I think there was a little bit of that, but that was of course, eroding very quickly, and within a few years would be gone completely.
Mm-hmm. And what was your position there?
I was a whole bunch of things, but generally kind of an assistant editor, deputy editor of the culture section, and then I wrote a weekly column about pop culture.
Okay, so this is completely, I mean, sports crosses over into pop culture for sure, but you were really not on your path to being a sports journalist, that's for sure, I would say.
Yeah, I think I was the nominal editor of the sports section there for a while, though that didn't really mean much because there weren't very many sports articles at Slate. But yes, I was not doing that full time by any sense of the imagination. I was just doing my thing.
Mm-hmm. And since you hadn't really taken journalism classes, I mean, did you take to this all pretty naturally, working at all these very varied places?
Nobody who saw my first drafts would say that. I think they would say Bryan seemed like a, reasonably bright guy, very enthusiastic. He showed up on time all the time. He made his deadlines. He did whatever, but he needed a lot of help in the beginning, and didn't know how to write an article like at all. And I think, so it was one of those things. The cool part about working at all those places was everybody was really, really smart. Everybody, had mastered this sort of style that's, where you write an editorial, but you're not trying to be George Will, right? You're not trying to use big words. You're trying to use really simple, direct language to make an argument. And you're hopefully making an argument that people haven't seen 1,000 times before. That was the big thing at Slate was don't write anything that exists already out in the world. If we're in favor of, I don't know, I'm trying to think of it, whatever, something about the war in Iraq. If that's already been written in the New York Times, you just don't need to write that. You can just assume people have already read that, and you should just write something completely different. Something you believe, but just something people haven't read. So it was interesting. It was just learning how to write. Like how do you write a lead? How do you write a kicker? How do you make? I remember somebody telling me you should have an idea in every paragraph, because remember, these are not reported stories. These are all almost opinion stories that are based on like what we at the time were Nexus dumps. So you need to have an idea in every paragraph. You need to have a good lead. You need to be funny. You need to do those kind of things. And then the second thing was just you need to be different. Everything you write can't be a variation of something that's already out in the world. Everything just has to be able to read them. It's like, oh, that's really interesting. I'd never thought of that. And that was the big thing there. Like they wouldn't let you write something that seemed sort of ordinary in terms of opinion. They wanted something really, really different and new.
Right. And that's good advice to get early on, even if you're not in the realm of opinion. Just, if somebody's already doing it, if the New York Times is already doing it, you shouldn't be trying to duplicate that. That's not how you stand out as a journalist. Even if it's uncovering new facts, you should, find your own new facts, not just, chase what the pack is chasing. Cool. So what happens after Slate? 6 years is quite a while. What leads to the next jump? So
I worked in some sports articles in there, especially about the sports media, going back to my early interest in the subject. Mm-hmm. Stories about, the way sports writers worked, and some, I would see people covering something the wrong way, and I'd write a story about it. I'd sort of put together enough of those stories. And then the New York Times was starting, this is in 2005, a magazine that was a quarterly sports magazine called Play. Mm-hmm. And they said, we have the New York Times magazine that's weekly. We're going to do a couple things. We're going to do a real estate magazine. We're going to do a sports magazine. This sounds like a very mid-aughts kind of idea. We're going to put even more paper into the universe. But they hired this great guy named Mark Bryant, who had been editor of Outside magazine in its glory days. He'd edited John Krakauer's, piece of Into the Wild and Into Thin Air and all those things. And so he came with these, he was a great editor, a great friend of mine still today. And somebody sent him, I think a mutual friend of ours sent him some of those stories I've written for Slate, and said, you should hire this guy to write a media column. because he could really do it. And he read them, and then I wrote him a really long memo about what kinds of stuff I would cover if I was going to be his media columnist, and he hired me. And that was a huge break for me, and I think I was 27, something like that. And again, felt like getting a little bit of a call up to the New York Times. It was a magazine. It was something at the time that was kind of challenging Sports Illustrated a little bit, not directly, but just, by proxy anyway. And it was so exciting. I just remember being so happy and so absolutely freaked out at that moment. I was finally going to get to do this thing that I was actually going to be a sports writer, which I hadn't really been full-time at all. Mm-hmm. And I was also going to get to write about the sports media, which was my stupid passion within sports writing. And I thought, that's the coolest thing I've ever heard. This is amazing. And I was going to get to do it at the New York Times, where everybody, a lot of people anyway, were going to read it. I was going to have a forum where it would get read. So yeah. And that allowed me to, it wasn't a full-time job because they only came out 4 times a year, but it allowed me to quit my day job and essentially write for them and then write freelance some other magazine stories and make a job that way.
Wow. Yeah, that's incredible at that age. And I mean, yeah, that was going to be my question. You're a columnist. You're only writing one column every 3 months?
Yeah. Yeah. It was a little hard to be timely, it turned out, at a quarterly. I'd get this, email saying, "Hey, what do you want to write for the next issue?" And it was 3 months away, and you're thinking, wow, what's going to be interesting then? That was a weird challenge. And sometimes it was fun because you could say, okay, it's going to be basketball season, so I want to write about this announcer, and he will still be an announcer when the season starts, and I know it'll be okay, or the Olympics are coming up or something like that. But it was really hard. And I think, ultimately, I think there was a sense maybe within Play that at some point we were going to be monthly. And I was thinking, okay, I'm going to get to write this column every month, and it'll basically be my full-time job. But, then of course the housing bubble happens in 2008, 2009, and Play was actually just canceled. But it was a very, very fun run there of 3 years. I really, really enjoyed it.
Yeah. That's an incredible opportunity. And so once the magazine gets canceled, what happens to you? Do they retain you in some way? Or are you cut loose, or how does that
They didn't retain me because we were just our own little garage band within the Times. Mm-hmm. So I didn't have a job, I think this happened sort of right at the end of Play, but I was so lucky again. There's a theme here, just how lucky I've been so many times in my life. Mm-hmm. But Tina Brown at this point, former editor of The New Yorker, was starting a website. At this point, she'd done Vanity Fair, The New Yorker, and she'd done Talk. And she'd gone and done this talk show, and now she was going to start her own website, which turned into The Daily Beast. And a former Slate editor said, we should talk to Bryan Curtis. He might want to do this. So she invited me in. I remember she paid me to come do an editorial brainstorming session with her for like 3 days in the middle of the week. And we were in Manhattan at the IAC building because it was going to be owned by Barry Diller. And sitting in there, and I didn't even know the name of the publication. I'd never met Tina in my life, which was very exciting for a journalism nerd like me. And we sat there, making up, what would we cover today? What would the headline of the story be if we covered this today? It turns out Tina and I have a very similar sense of humor somehow, her via British tabloids and me via something else. I don't know, American sports pages, whatever it is. And she hired me as kind of an editor/writer for her. And I wound up working for her for the next couple of years.
Wow. Yeah. And that was right when the Daily Beast was starting up, right? And
yes. Yeah, okay. She hired me. I think I was there about 6 months before we launched. We launched in October 2008.
Really on the ground level for that.
Yeah, it was very fun. I mean, we were kind of sitting in an office kind of staring at each other for months and months. And it was interesting with Tina because, she was she's so legendary for being, what's hot, right? That was both her gift and what people would then, make fun of her for. But she just had this idea, this sort of spidey sense of what is going to be a magazine article. What should somebody write right now? And I remember there was one, and I can't remember the topic. I think it was about Madonna. But she came in the office one day and she said, somebody should write about Madonna. I don't remember if it was Madonna's plastic surgery. I don't remember what it was. Somebody should do a piece breaking this down. That would be a great story. This is before we even have a website. So she's just talking here. And then like a month later, it was in New York Magazine. Like Adam Moss had gotten at the same idea. And it was like you could see this weird skill of magazine editors is that they could see around corners, right? They're all working on these weird schedules where they're a monthly or a weekly or whatever it is. And they have to figure out not what's interesting right now, but what's going to be interesting in a month or 2 months. And she could do that and do it really, really effortlessly. It was just such a weird superpower to see up close. And I can't do that. I have no talent for doing that. But she was it was just amazing. She did that all the time. That was her skill among many.
Mm-hmm. And were you still focused on opinion stuff at that point?
Yeah, I was kind of. They sort of they let me edit politics. They first assigned me to create. They had a daily news digest. In fact, they still do. I think that was like where somebody would get up at 4 a.m. and essentially what are the top 10 headlines of the day. Read everything and give me kind of a smart news digest. Okay, so Obama did this, and then this happened, and here's some foreign news, and then this happened, and here's a funny story, and here's a Hollywood story. So I sort of ran that for a few months, and then became just more of a conventional editor. I wrote a lot of pieces on the side, stuff like that. They let me freelance a lot of stories for Texas Monthly and magazines like that. So I didn't really stop writing magazine stories, but that was basically the job, was to kind of just be an editor. And then I wrote lots of headlines because I love writing funny headlines. So like Tina would always assign me to write headlines and stuff like that.
Sure. And in these magazine stories you're doing on the side, I mean, is that would those be like more reported stories? Were you also the kind of journalist who was picking up the phone, interviewing people, that sort of thing?
Yeah, they would be less columny and more featurey. So I'd get on a plane to Texas and go write about Texas quarterbacks or the Texas Rangers. These were a lot of sports stories. I'm trying to think of what else I did during that period. Just all kinds of things. But yeah, mostly reported type stories.
Sure. And then what's the next step from there? Is that Grantland, or what happens next? Yeah,
it is Grantland. So Simmons, I'm sitting in the Daily Beast, and I was fine, but I was also thinking like I don't really want to spend any time as an editor. Like I don't love it. I like editing. I hope I enjoyed working with writers, but I would just kind of at some level always be mad that I wasn't writing something.
Sure.
So I just get frustrated, like, why am I not doing this story? Why don't I get a chance? So I was sort of looking to write more and figure out ways to write more. And I was kind of downsizing myself at the Beast. I would say, okay, why don't I just work half time and I'll come in and help you do things and whatever. But I need this time to write. And Simmons happened to be starting Grantland in 2011. In fact, 10 years ago this summer. And he emailed me and said, hey, do you have any ideas? And I said, yeah. And so I sent him a memo, and he gave me kind of like a mini contract. This was before the site launched. And I didn't even know what Grantland was going to be at this point. I don't think anybody did. And so he gave me a mini contract and said, this is great. Write. I don't remember even how many pieces he expected me to write, probably like 6 or 7, something like that, over the course of a year. And it'll be great. And so that was really, really fun. I wrote my first one before we launched. I think it ran the second week of the site, maybe like a week and a half into the site's launch. And yeah, and all of a sudden there was this big canvas that was really the job I had always wanted. I couldn't have articulated it to you, but a job where you could write in lots of different kinds of styles. You could write columns, you could write features, you could write oral histories, you could write whatever it is Brian Phillips writes, which is a magical form that is completely all of its own. You could just do all kinds of things, and you could also write about politics a little bit within sports, right? You could just take a story in any direction you wanted to do. And so that was just such a cool opportunity. And so I was on that small contract. And then it was funny because I think what happened is, I don't know if these things were connected, but I wrote a profile for the New York Times Magazine. I have Grantland. I'm kind of freelancing. I'm sort of still at the Beast at the same time. And I wrote this profile for the New York Times Magazine. I think the next day, the guy who was running Grantland sent me a note and said, hey, do you want to come on full time and just write for us? And I said, yeah, that sounds fantastic. So that was that. and I've been with that team ever since.
Wow, what was the profile?
It was of George Lucas.
Oh wow.
Yeah, which is gonna come up later in this podcast because you asked me to think about some questions. So I was gonna save that, but yeah, it was about George Lucas.
Sure, let's definitely get into it. But yeah, Grantland, I mean, was this brilliant site because they could do whatever. It was, this sports culture. There was no like hardline division, like anything could kind of go on the site. And I mean, that's where I first became familiar with your work. I mean, when I was a correspondent in Beijing, like I'd always like walk down to a noodle shop and like read Grantland on my lunch break, like as like, the escape from whatever the wire service journalism I'm doing. And I remember, being in a specific noodle shop when I like opened up my phone and it's like Grantland has closed. It was such a bummer. Like I really hadn't seen it coming. So, I mean, that's why when I ask you what's next, I presume that is what's next, that, everybody kind of had to move on once it shuttered its doors.
Everybody had to move on. And then I worked a little bit just at ESPN kind of basically throughout the end of my contract. But then I went out and wound up working for Simmons again. So, for me, it obviously something came to an end and that sucked on a lot of levels. But then Bill was starting something new. It was The Ringer, which is very similar in a lot of ways, and was working for all the exact, pretty much the exact same people that I worked for at Grantland. So it was awesome. It wasn't much of a transition at all. It was just like, oh, okay, cool. Here's the next thing. Let's do this.
And Grantland and The Ringer, I guess, kind of have this kind of ragtag vibe about you guys. And I was just curious, are these newsroom environments? Are these places where... Was Grantland a newsroom? Is The Ringer a newsroom where you all sit in a room? Or, I mean, pre-pandemic.
It was. I was going to say, back when anybody had a newsroom. It's funny because I was in New York, living in Brooklyn when I was writing for Grantland. So, and Grantland was headquartered in L.A. So there was a newsroom, but I was never in it. And it was really a kind of a collection of people who ran it and editors, but there were a whole bunch of freelance writers scattered throughout. And then when we got to The Ringer, it just seemed like we had generally more people in L.A. My wife and I moved to L.A., where she was from anyway, and there were just tons of people in the newsroom there. So by The Ringer time, I can attest, we definitely had a very cool newsroom, which is always really fun to me. To me, the newsroom, I don't know how you feel about this, but it's the best place in the world because it has other journalists who are just really fun, crazy, neurotic people to be around. And it's the worst place in the world because you're just talking to them all day and you don't get anything done.
Right.
Because they're telling you all their problems and all the great stories they're going to write and this and that, or just having cool conversations. And then you're like, wait, I think I'm supposed to work too. And so I wind up, spending a few days at home actually working and then go in the office and talk to people.
Sure. And I love newsroom environments. Brasilia, it's a pretty small newsroom and we haven't been in it for a while, but still, I miss being in that environment. And about those conversations, talking to other people, I mean, this was a while back, a couple months back, I was looking at your, recent work for The Ringer. And, you obviously do the Press Box podcast, which is a couple times a week. And if you look yourself up on there, that's most of what you do. And then you see some occasional sports pieces. And then occasionally you see something out of left field about like a movie or something like that you'll have been drawn in and write it with, 3 other people. I forget what the one I saw was, but I was just curious how much those just come like in my imagination. You're standing around the office and this somehow comes up and then they realize, oh, Bryan had an interesting take about this. We're going to pull him into this piece. And I was just wondering if that's how those kind of more, crossover type pieces happen, or
this is the movie thing where a bunch of people weigh in on that on the movie.
I think it was one of those that you had done several months back.
I was going to say, I don't remember doing one of these. So are we sure it was me?
I mean,
maybe I did.
Unfortunately, it's already been a couple months since I did my research on you, so I can't remember. But it was some pop culture thing.
But that is a very Ringer thing. Yes. Can you dive in and on this? Yeah. And there's lots of those kinds of things. And this is one thing that's great about working there is that there are no lines between the departments. It's not like an old the newspaper where it's like, okay, these people may write about entertainment and these people may write about sports and these people may do this. I mean, everybody can write about everything and does, you know, and there's some people that have kind of a more defined lane, but people just write about stuff, and that's such a cool place to be. I really, really like that.
Sure. And now that I've heard your biography, one of the questions I sent you, I've realized doesn't make too much sense. But just to explain, like the reason, you know, I invited you on the podcast is I had interviewed Tim Cato, and he's a journalist for The Athletic in Dallas, reporting on the Mavericks. And one thing with him is, you know, he's been a sports journalist since he was 15. And he just, you know, he basically said this, that, you know, he would like to try to do different stuff. He, you know, doesn't want to do sports since he's 15 till he dies, which is understandable. And then we were chatting about, like, who has this quote unquote crossover appeal. And of course, like, who comes up but two guys named Bryan who both work at The Ringer and used to work at Grantland, you know, Bryan Phillips and Bryan Curtis. And he said, oh, like, I kind of know Bryan Curtis. You should have him on. I try to make an introduction, and that's how we are here today. So I wanted to ask you about that kind of crossover appeal and how you define yourself. But it's pretty clear from your biography. I don't know what I expected pre-Grantland. I thought it was going to be, I don't know, newspaper sports reporter or something. But all along, you've kind of had this crossover appeal, I guess I would say.
Well, I would just say it's also just kind of something between a short attention span and just getting tired of one or the other, you know, because I would just be a full-on sports person, and then I would just be like, I've just hit the wall with this. I want to do something else. You know, I want to think about another issue or another topic or whatever it is and just write something else. And the nice part is now I can kind of do it day to day and week to week. But I always found, like, I love sports. I love, if I ever said, like, somebody says, what are you? What's your job? I would say I'm a sports writer. I love that. That's what I want to be. That's what I always wanted to be since I was a kid. That is my identity. But I want to be a sports writer, and I want to also be able to write about lots of different kinds of things. I would just be really, really bored if I was only writing about sports. Nowadays, I think that doesn't sound very different from it all. You know, everybody who's at Defector, who is at Old Deadspin, who, you know, people that write for The Athletic. I mean, there's lots of people that just do different kinds of things within the sports beat. But, you know, when I was growing up, that did not exist all that much. And I was always just kind of like, I don't think I would have articulated it, but I would have wanted a job if I'd been able to pin it down. I would say, well, I want to write about sports, but I also just want to be able to just think about different things, write about different things, that I'm not just focusing on one thing.
Yeah. And you found the perfect place now at The Ringer. And then I guess the last, you know, thing about kind of your career to talk about is your podcast, The Press Box, which is, you know, I would not call it a sports podcast, even though sports figure in pretty heavily. Like, you talk about it, you know, whatever's in the news about it, but it's, you know, whatever the zeitgeist is in the media kind of is what you talk about, sports or not. How long have you been doing that, and kind of how did that start? And also, you don't have any background in radio, but when I listen to it, you sound like you sound like you have that radio sports voice. And like,
listen to you. Thank you very much. That's nice to hear. I don't have any background in radio. We've been doing it for about 2 years. David Shoemaker, the guy doing it, who is also a veteran of Grantland, works for The Ringer and also happens to be my best friend from the time we were 14 years old and in high school together in Fort Worth, Texas. So that's just one of those funny things that happened. Like, he and I went to high school together, lived together in New York as we were coming up, right? We were roommates, and we both started writing for Grantland, and then we are now at The Ringer, and now we do a podcast together. So this is like modern friendship, right? Our friendship has been turned into a podcast.
That's crazy. Yeah.
That's what happens. No, but the great part about doing with him is I've spent the Malcolm Gladwell rule of do everything for 10,000 hours and you become an expert. The only thing I've ever done for 10,000 hours is talk to David, usually at bars, you know, about all kinds of the questions of the universe, us just sitting there and just talking. I mean, just entertaining ourselves by just talking to each other about, I don't know, sports, movies, the media, I guess, everything. So when we decided to do a podcast, it would just seem like the most natural thing in the world to talk to David Shoemaker twice a week. Because I'm like, we can do this. We do this all the time. We can kind of, it's funny because Chris Ryan and Andy Greenwald at The Ringer are also very old friends.
Right. Yeah.
And have that vibe. I think they have the best podcast vibe of basically anybody on the planet, because they just talk like people who know everything about each other, who know where the other one's going to go, but it doesn't sound like they're, doing a Broadway show. Like it's not like they're doing an act like, hey, what do you got here? They just have a really, really natural rapport.
Right,
but anyway, that's the fun part of doing it with David. As for sounding like a person who had some audio experience, I think that's because I've been writing about sports announcers for so long that I'm just unconsciously imitating them, and I get that vocal quality in my voice because I've been listening to too many baseball games over the years. So I think it's imitation more than anything else.
Sure. And I mean, how did you start doing it? How did you come up with the idea? And also, now it seems like it makes up perhaps the lion's share of your job at The Ringer, at least in terms of output. Yeah,
it's certainly, if you look at, as you say, if you look at the thing, it's like, because I do it twice a week, right? I don't do anything else twice a week necessarily. It came out of, there was an idea that people were interested in me doing a podcast of some kind. I think somehow we settled on the name The Press Box. I dabbled around in it. I'd have, if there was a big media story, I'd have somebody on, but I did it every, like, very, very, once every couple of weeks or couple of months or something. It was not like a continuous thing. And, we kind of talked, like, what are you going to do with this? There were some very sports media focused podcasts around that would just be like, here's Joe Buck, here's Al Michaels, here's this, and let's talk about this. And I didn't want to do that because, again, that just to go back to the thing I told you earlier about, it just seems like so much of your life is that, and wanting to have another outlet.
Sure.
And to talk about other things. But so two things happened. One, David volunteered to do it with me, which was fantastic, because I was like, great, this is what I want. I always like podcasts where two people are talking to each other, not necessarily, a podcast where you're just trying to bring famous people on to do interviews. No offense to you, but certainly I'm not including myself in the famous category here, but you know what I mean.
Sure,
I like when there's a vibe where I can, like, where it feels like I'm parachuting into a friendship, and the friendship is the friends are sort of also talking about stuff. So I wanted to do that kind of podcast, but and then we kind of, it's funny. I think world events basically dragged us around for a while. Like, we weren't going to do lots of politics, but what else were we going to do over the last couple of years? What else were we going to do in January? Which is like the most insane month. What I think we at The Ringer, like a lot of other places, we have emergency podcasts. Like, I don't know, a movie came out or something crazy happened in sports. Like, we had like emergency state of democracy podcasts. Like, what is happening right now? We need to talk about this. So. Yeah, it's been kind of dictated by that. I think post-election we've been able to talk more about things like Naomi Osaka and the French Open, and some just, we've been able to have people like Chuck Todd on. We've just been able to do sort of broader things in media, which is probably our happy place. But we stand ready whenever there's political news to jump on that too.
Cool. And yeah, I would definitely agree. You and Schumacher have a good that sort of patter of people who have known each other a long time. And I would say particularly in the pandemic, that's like the sweet spot of podcasts that I have wanted to listen to is, people who know each other well, talking to each other, whether it's The Watch, whether it's, I don't know, the McElroy brothers or something, just like these sorts of, kind of funny friends talking to each other, probably because we're not getting a whole lot of that in our real lives.
Yeah, we're craving friendship, so we'll take it any way we can get it.
Okay, great. So I would say that's probably good for the biography section. Is there anything you want to add before we move on to talk about some stories?
No, I'm good. I've talked about myself plenty, so yeah, let's move on.
Cool. Okay, so there are two questions about stories I always ask, and I'd like to start with the one that's more of a downer so we can end on a high note. And the first one I ask is, what is a quote-unquote story that got away? A story that you wanted to do, maybe you tried to do, it went wrong for some reason, or you could never convince an editor, or you could never get the source you needed to talk to you, or whatever reason. But what's a story you wanted to do but kind of it got away from you?
This is the question that I'm going to duck, Jake, and I'll tell you why, because this is actually the most haunting thing to me of what you've heard is a totally happy career and fulfilling career in life, which is because the thing that bugs me most of all are those stories. And they're not stories necessarily. I'd say the ones in my category that I would think of are not stories where I didn't get the person just wouldn't talk to me, right? I ran into a reporting block. The stories were stuff that I was allowed to do, equipped to do, maybe even half did, and just never wrote it because I had to move on to something else, or, I got distracted by something else. So they're my fault. And those are the things that drive me absolutely nuts. And I hate thinking about them. I also have this crazy notion that someday I will write them and redeem myself in my own mind. There's this funny, I was talking to a movie producer one time interviewing him, and he was like, he remembered going into the office of an aging director who I think had been on the blacklist, like this was a guy who had a very interesting Hollywood career, but he walks into the movie director's office, and behind the director there are all these scripts, and they're all the movies the director has made. And he goes, "Oh my goodness, look at this, is so cool, all these scripts of your movies." And the director says, No. Those are the movies I've made. These are the movies, and he points to this other bookshelf with all these unmade scripts are the movies I have yet to make. and that's how I feel about those stories. I just who cares about the ones I wrote? What about the stupid ones that got away? So that's my clever way of ducking your question. And hopefully I will write one or two of these pieces and find some peace.
Sure. Yeah, no, I mean, I definitely have some ideas that kind of eat away at the back of my brain that are just, they're never the burning story that needs to be done. And they just kind of don't get done for that reason.
I know. And it sucks, doesn't it? It just absolutely sucks when you only kind of blame yourself. It's not, that editor, I couldn't convince him, because I have lots of editors that are very nice about saying yes. And, I just didn't get it done. And that just pisses me off.
Right. And I feel like media about journalists kind of like reinforces that, just because like there are all these stories of the intrepid reporter who doesn't give a shit about what anybody else thinks, and he just finds time on his own time, and he makes the calls and he makes it happen. And like, it is possible, but I mean, I don't know. I'm pretty hard pressed for time with my job, and like, I don't know. I don't know that I necessarily need to be a workaholic and be doing this story, but it still kind of like eats away at you, and you blame yourself. But
we need more stories about reporters that just really screw it up. That's what they're not Stephen Glass style screw it up. Just don't get the job done. That's what we need, more stories, and we can normalize that experience.
Sure. Well, trying on the podcast. I'm trying.
There we go.
Okay, cool. And then I guess to move on to the high note, if you could pick one story you've done any time in your career and just tell us a little bit about what the story was, how you went about doing it, got the idea, start to finish, any reaction, kind of the story behind the story.
Sure. This is one that just popped into mind. It was at Grantland. It was just because it was a particularly satisfying experience. I don't know if I wrote it so well or what, but it was just from a reporting point of view, very, very satisfying and enjoyable. There had been this whole thing. So the NBA, Kevin Durant and Russell Westbrook, neither of whom are still there, were both playing for the Oklahoma City Thunder at the time. And we were in this kind of weird zone where on Twitter, and mostly also on websites at the time, people would post video of the players from the Oklahoma City Thunder kind of just saying mean things to reporters who were asking them questions after a game. It became this weird currency, and it was almost like a lot of sports Twitter and the internet had gotten to this point where they thought it was the reporter's fault whenever the player was mad. Like that was what was happening. But it was it was just a perfect prompt for a story, which is what's happening here. Why does this keep happening in Oklahoma City in particular? So I sent that to my editor. He said, that sounds great. And I flew down there, and I wound up doing a bunch of things, one of which was just go to a Thunder game and go into the locker room and sort of see what that environment was like. To to see how really, really short and obligatory these post-game interviews are. I think the one I watched just lasted like a couple of minutes. There was just absolutely no information exchanged at all. It was clear that Russell Westbrook, who was a player, didn't want to do it. It was very, very uncomfortable. And nothing bad had happened that night. It wasn't like he'd had some terrible professional setback. It was just a typical night on the beat. And then the other thing I did is I just went and called everybody who covered the team. And what was funny was they were like, no, the players aren't mad at us. They don't hate the media. They don't hate us individually. They just have absolutely no relationship with us at all. They barely know who we are. They don't care to know who we are. They have been told essentially by the organization that they can spend the absolute minimal time with us. So you had this really very interesting sort of thing that had happened, which Oklahoma City, which is a smallish market by NBA standards, by pro sports standards, has these two giant internationally famous basketball players there. Mm-hmm. And then you have these guys writing for the Oklahoman newspaper who are covering them. And the world has changed so much that basketball player's Twitter account is 1 billion times bigger than not only the reporter of the Oklahomans, but the Oklahoman itself. And they just don't need him anymore.
Right.
And it was just a really interesting way. That's something that I think anybody who covers sports already knew, but it was in a really interesting way just to illustrate it. And you have all these like tick-offs, right? When you write a bigger story, you need anecdotes. There were lots of anecdotes about how especially the press minders there had kind of kept the players away from the reporters. You need a main character, somebody who can help you tell the story, and that was this guy Barry Trammell, who was and is the Daily Oklahoman's columnist. This gray-haired guy who spent almost his entire career in Oklahoma City. Like, he's just the guy, and he is the most famous sports writer by 1,000 points in Oklahoma. And he was having the same thing. And he was, he and I remember going to breakfast and him talking to me and just being really sad, because it was like this wonderful thing had happened for his career, which was that, Oklahoma City had gotten a professional sports franchise. And, and here were some of the biggest stars in basketball that were in his backyard. They could write about it, and he didn't know them. And he was never going to know them. He gave me this quote, and he said, he was talking about Russell Westbrook. He said, "I hope he stays forever, but unfortunately it's not going to be any kind of relation-based situation. I'm just going to be writing about how great he is. I'm not going to be writing about who he is." Mm-hmm. Which I thought was so, it was on its own. I thought it was just very kind of heartrending, but also it sort of explained a lot of what sports writing has become, where these guys are so big that people in our business just don't see them all that much anymore. And they don't have, it's not possible to have the relationship with them that you could have had 10, 20, 30, and certainly 40 years ago. So anyway, it was just a really satisfying story on those grounds.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. And I read that book about Oklahoma City, Boomtown, so I kind of am familiar with that era a little bit. Yeah, and who did you write that for?
Grantland.
Okay, cool. Well, I'll look for that, and I'll throw a link up to it in the podcast description so people can check it out. Sounds like a good story. I mean, how do you deal with that type of situation? I haven't talked about that much on the podcast, but it's something I have to do fairly regularly. You go out to Oklahoma City. I'm assuming you don't have much point of reference for Oklahoma City, and you've got to report this thing out. Just curious how you go about doing that.
ESPN had a reporter in Oklahoma City, Royce Young still does in Oklahoma City, who was really, really helpful to me just in terms of the lay of the land and kind of, here's XYZ, that kind of stuff. But, it was mainly just going to a game and talking to people, just walking up and talking to people. And, it was interesting because the journalists were so frustrated and sort of understood that it was a problem that they didn't have any inhibitions about talking about it. So it was just really, it was one of those, how you have stories where you have to dig and dig and dig, and then sometimes you do what you're supposed to do, but it all just kind of comes to you. And that was one of those where it just all kind of fell into place really, really nicely.
That's great. Cool. I'll definitely check it out after this. And that does make me curious because George Lucas was not in that story, so I'm sure we have him ahead still to look forward to. Next, I guess we'll move on to the lightning round, which is faster-paced questions. Feel free to answer at whatever length you want. It's shorter than tell me the story of your life, though, which was really the first part of the interview.
Yeah, I thought these answers should be about 30 minutes long each, so let's do it.
And whatever length you want, but they'll be faster-paced. Do you feel ready?
I'm ready. I am ready. Let's do it.
Great. What is a must-read publication that you look at every day for your job? And I'm not talking about the obvious publication, but maybe if there's something you want to shout out that you think is particularly good that helps you keep up on stuff. So I'm not looking for the New York Times, and you also can't say your own publication, The Ringer. But if there's something else.
Can we say the not obvious version of the obvious publication, which is the print edition of the New York Times?
Sure.
So I insist on getting that. It's horrifically expensive. I think it's like $600 a year.
Wow.
And you have to call like every once in a while and convince them to give you a lower rate because it's so much money. But I cannot think of anything more valuable in my life because obviously we all read the New York Times. Everybody reads the New York Times. Even if you don't like the New York Times, you read the New York Times.
Right.
But when you have the print edition in your hand, all the problems of modern media where it's like, oh my God, I'm getting sucked into this weird Twitter fight and all this stuff. It just doesn't happen. You read the paper. And if you're interested in reading, in depth on anything else, which you almost certainly will be, it's all there. It's all there, and you get some international news, you get politics, you get Biden, you get a few opinions. It's just, I don't think anything organizes my brain better than looking at and I don't always read every article. I certainly don't read it cover to cover, but just having that, in fact, I just bought it out here, and I'm excited to go down and read it when we're done. I just can't it just organizes my mind in a happy way that reading news online never will.
That makes sense to me. I mean, get away from a screen, kind of, it's a more leisurely experience. I just feel like it would be like the New Yorker problem everybody used to joke about. I feel like I would have 1,000 copies of the New York Times lying around and that I'd meant to get to read, but that I wasn't able to.
But that's the thing, Jake, is you actually throw them away when they're newspapers. You don't need to put the stack of the. But it's also, I would say, it's not just leisurely. It's that it cuts off. It gives you a well-rounded education every morning, which is something that Twitter doesn't necessarily do. Right? Twitter's the best. Twitter's an awesome source for news. So I'm not going to be like a super old man here, but when I read Twitter, I learn lots about things that may or may not be important to me. I see lots of movie trailers, things like that. When I read the New York Times, I just here's something that's going on in Poland. Here's what's going on in politics. And I just feel like I've learned a little about a lot of things. So that's happy.
Sure. And then what is a publication you read, listen to, or watch just for fun? So it can be any medium, text, podcast, whatever, but purely for fun, not related to your job and kind of journalistic in nature.
There is a podcast / radio show on BBC Radio 4 called In Our Time. Have you ever listened to In Our Time?
Yeah, I've listened to a couple episodes.
Yeah, so it's kind of amazing because it can be about any topic. It's essentially hosted by this guy named Melvin Bragg, who's been in British media for a really long time. And what he does is he'll pick a topic, and then he convenes a panel of 3 or 4 professors, and essentially they just at length they spend an hour just explaining and talking about the topic. I'll give you some recent ones: the Boxer Rebellion, the Maya Civilization, the Statue of Liberty. I listened to one on the California Gold Rush the other day, and it just feels so out of time, so different from everything I have to do on a daily basis that is my favorite thing that doesn't necessarily impact what I'm doing on a daily basis.
Yeah, that's great. I haven't listened to it in a while, but previous guest at this point, probably like 40 episodes ago, recommended it to a guy in Romania who freelances for the New York Times. So you're in good company.
Oh, that's awesome.
And then let's see. What is the best journalistic article, piece, or whatever you have consumed recently? And it can't be from your own publication, but sorry if I forgot to tell you that in advance.
No, it's okay. There was a piece on ESPN.com last July, and I just read it because I was doing some judging for an awards thing. It's called The Hero of Goodall Park by Tom Junot. Are you familiar with the story?
I don't think so.
So this is this kind of story, which is a kind of true crime mystery, kind of thing. When I see these kind of stories, I run screaming in the other direction because there are too many of them in our world right now. Too many podcasts about true crime, too much writing about true crime, too many murders, too many of these things. Also, I just feel like when people write these kind of stories, they're like, Adam Dunn, the baseball player trying to hit a home run at every at bat.
Right.
And, you get the workup and all the color and everything. And then it just nothing happens. There's no payoff because either the case was kind of unresolved or the writer just didn't, I don't know. I don't like these kind of stories. So I read this story, but it was Tom Junot. So I read this story recently. And in fact, I think I had avoided it when it came out, but I was reading it. This story is awesome. This story is incredible. It starts out with a car just riding out of control around a baseball field during a game, like a car driven off the street, and everybody reacting and trying to get the hell out of the way. One person kind of emerging as a hero of the encounter, and then it just goes into the backstories and all the sort of buried things like that have happened with all the people that are standing on that field, the person driving the car, all those kinds of things. Again, I understand this sounds like something that could potentially be bad, but this is one of those cases where it just turns into Mayor of Easttown. I mean, it's just like, you're like, holy cow, this is good. And Tom Junot, who I do not know, wrote it so well. I know of his career, of course, I just don't know him personally. He wrote it so well. It is so good. It's told in parts. Also, if I see any piece of journalism that says part 1, I also run screaming away.
Yeah.
But this is one where I could not wait to read the whole thing. And I read it in one sitting, and it was just a perfectly told, amazingly reported piece of journalism. I'm being a little vague because I don't want to give away anything about it.
No, that's perfectly fine. And yeah, I would say I know what you mean. I think I read a piece the other day about like some big digitized therapy company, like psychotherapy company in Sweden or something, had a huge leak. And, it starts with this amazing story of some guy whose, terrible psychological history was like leaked on the internet and the impact on him. But there was no follow through whatsoever. I read it to the end and I'm like, this story doesn't go anywhere. Like, it had such great promise. And I won't say the name or anything just because I don't want to, criticize people, but that sounds great. What was the name of the story and where did it appear? Just one more time.
It was called "The Hero of Goodall Park" by Tom Junot in ESPN.com.
Cool. I'll look for it. Is there any particular subject matter you geek out about that is not related to your job?
Movies, probably a little bit. Old movies that I guess this is all tangentially related to my job. I've been reading a lot of books about like explorers lately. I don't know why, but yeah, no, I just kind of run around the whole ballpark and read all kinds of stuff.
Cool. And then this is kind of a broad question, but what is the either coolest or craziest place or situation that being a journalist has gotten you into, the type of situation where you're like, I cannot believe this is my job or this is my life?
So that's where we come to George Lucas. This was the New York Times Magazine. He had just made the movie Red Tails. I don't know if you remember that, which was kind of something he did not direct, but it was kind of his swan song as a producer, and he was then going off into retirement. Mm-hmm. And I convinced the Times Magazine to let me write about it. And I'm not somebody, I don't know about you, but I'm not somebody who ever really gets starstruck around people that I'm interviewing. Like, it just doesn't. Mm-hmm. I'm always one of those things where I'm always like, this will be neat to reflect on later if I actually write a good story. But if I don't write a good story, it'll be stupid and I'll just be mad. So I don't care. And I also just don't, I have never personally liked doing the whole kind of fanboy, fangirl thing. Like, oh my God, this person's awesome. I just don't think that way. So I'm pretty just resistant to everything like that. But I got sent to do this and I was very excited to do it. And I walk into the office and I just remember sitting down. I'm like, oh my God, this is George Lucas. It was the one time in my life where I've just been really, it wasn't even like excited or happy. It was more just like, wow. Sitting in his office, it was at Skywalker Ranch, Northern California. There was I had toured the facilities where there's like a statue of Yoda in a water fountain. I remember he had this kind of very expensive looking painting of Padme Amidala from the Star Wars prequels behind him when we were talking. We were sitting in this room. It was almost like all the prequel movies had been made into fancy art. And, he also, Skywalker Ranch has like every old movie poster at the time he had bought and put. So you're walking through these halls and halls of like old movie posters. It was so amazing. It was just a very cool place. But just talking to George Lucas, I don't think anything has ever been an out of body experience and how did I get here kind of moment than that. That was my number one.
Wow. Yeah, that's pretty cool. I mean, did the one thing I've got to ask though was how did it feel to then be forced to talk to him about the movie Red Tails as opposed to his more well-known work?
Well, I think I worked in some questions about the other stuff too. We definitely talked about Star Wars. At the end, I was like, "Can I just get in one about Indiana Jones before we go, just for my own personal interest?" And I think I turned that into a piece later. But yeah, it was really, really fun.
And then the next question, I believe, is if you had to trade places with one journalist, living or dead, and you would have their career, who would it be?
This is so hard because you want to go back in time, right? Because I think all of us in journalism have this kind of golden age idea that things were better in some age that we weren't working in. Like, wouldn't it have been romantic to be one of those hard drinking sports writers from the 60s and 70s? So I didn't have a name for you. So I think one thing that would be really cool is to be, when we're talking about the Oklahoma City Thunder, to be in an era where, as a sports writer, where athletes would actually talk to you, where you would walk into the locker room after the game and, they might be pissed off, they might be angry, but you would have some home numbers. You would be at the bar, you would have that sort of thing. I think the downside of that would be, you couldn't write stories like you could now. And I'm not just talking about like covering up for the athlete. I just mean like, the organs, newspapers and magazines just wouldn't give you the freedom that writing has now. But I think it would be so interesting to see it from the other side of the fence, right? We live in this time where it's like, right. Oh my God, we got the internet, got all the information we need at our fingertips. We, those of us who are lucky to have really cool jobs, we can write in a way we want to write. We can do this, but those guys are very distant. What if we were on the other side of the fence? Something sounds like an episode of Quantum Leap or something. What if we were on the other side of the fence and we could be like, oh my God, all these guys are Mickey Mantle, here's Roger Maris, here's everybody. I work for a newspaper. I have to file, 800 words on deadline. It'd just be funny. I would just love to see that from the other side of the fence and kind of understand what that was really like.
Yeah, for sure. I wonder a lot about that. Like, I don't know. I think about like the scene in the movie Gandhi where it's, what's his name? Martin Sheen is the reporter and he has to like rush to the phone and call in the news and like, I really wonder what it would have been like. I'm sure in many ways it would have been a pain in the ass, but it would be interesting to know.
Imagine if the phone didn't work.
Yeah.
It's like, oh my God, somebody is really mad at me because this very simple piece of machinery doesn't work. It'd been a fun time. It'd been interesting.
Mm-hmm. What is one thing you wish you could travel back in time and tell your younger self?
Ooh, that's a good question. I think just to ask for things you don't know, ask about things you don't know. Because there's a lot of times when I felt like, it was either when reporting a story or just like when hanging out in a newsroom where there was just something simple I didn't know. And I thought people expected me to already know. And now I would go back and say, hey, idiot, just ask a question. Just take somebody aside and go, hey, what am I supposed to do in this case? What should I do here? What's the first thing I should do what's the thing I should make sure I do when I report this story? I think I learned a lot of those things by accident or the hard way or, and of course a lot of journalism is like that, but I wished I'd just asked more questions early on in my life.
Sure. Yeah, that's good advice. What is one thing most people don't know about you?
What is one thing? I was just obsessed as a child with collecting autographs.
Huh.
I sort of want to get back into it because I miss it. So I'm in Fort Worth, Texas. right? I love Fort Worth, but it's not exactly Hollywood. It's not like celebrities are walking down the street every day. And I used to get those like hard photo mailing envelopes. And I used to get, kind of a manila envelope to put on top of it. And I would send letters to celebrities and ask for their autographs.
Huh.
And I did it first with athletes. When I was a kid, I'd send them a baseball card. And then I sort of graduated. And so I'd be like, oh, cool. Look at that actor and Married with Children. Why don't I write him a letter? And let me tell you something. I mean, I did this so much, and I got so many signed 8x10s back. And this was, again, there was nothing about making money here or selling them or anything. I wanted them to write my name to Bryan. Like that was the coolest thing to me. But I cannot tell you how many times I did that. And it was purely I was interested in those celebrities for sure. I liked the kind of, third hand contact with famous people, but mostly I just love autographs. And I just loved collecting them. And I've seen, like, now I guess nobody really cares about autographs anymore because they want to take selfies with famous people. That's what players have told me, that if they run into people on the street, nobody wants an autograph. They just want a selfie. They want a photo, right? So they can post it on Instagram. And I totally understand that. But I love autographs. And like I said, I kind of want to I have a son now who's 8, and I'm trying to get him into it so I can do it by proxy. So I can continue to collect.
That's great. That's such an old school thing. I remember my older brother wrote to some actor or comedian once and got one of those. But yeah, I haven't thought about that in a long time. I wonder if that still is a thing. If you get a hard copy letter in the mail as a celebrity, do you still send off? That's
like I said. I think I want to find out.
But yeah, people have moved on to the selfies and to NFTs or God knows what.
Oh my God, who wants that? Who wants that?
Right.
I want an old school autograph.
Right. Cool. That's a good one. And then what is your most embarrassing journalism related story, if you have one?
This one I had to kind of, I had to do some therapy to remember. 2002, Charlton Heston, the actor and gun rights advocate, is diagnosed with Alzheimer's, or it's announced that he had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's. Mm-hmm. So I was at Slate, and they had a column, I guess I don't think it's around anymore, called The Explainer, where essentially they would say, okay, we're going to run off and answer a question you have about the news. And I was the editor of that column, but I wasn't the reporter. But the reporter was gone that day, and so they said, hey, can you answer the question of whether Charlton Heston has to give up his, relinquish his guns now that he has been diagnosed with Alzheimer's? Now, this was done from a purely apolitical place. It was just one of those, that's an interesting question, right? Like, is that a thing? Is that another thing? So I remember calling somebody in the California government, Attorney General's office, whatever it was, I cannot remember, but making all these calls, getting somebody, and they're like, yeah, he's going to have to relinquish his guns. That's part of that's just something that people. So I was like, oh, great. So I wrote it up, and the story came out, and that was totally wrong, actually.
Ugh.
And I hadn't called lawyers who would have told me, well, probably not for these reasons. This is not. And I had written it very, very definitively. The person also the government official who told me that would not also call me back after the story was wrong, which put me in a really terrible position. So it got corrected. I was really embarrassed, and I was just really mad. And, it was one of those things where I just hadn't called enough people or the right people. And it made a real impression on me that I don't ever want to be caught out like that again.
Yeah. Good lesson learned, but yeah, tough. Like, I've realized that embarrassing question most of the time, you expect, embarrassing story, it's going to be hilarious. But no, every journalist who's had an answer to that question, it's actually kind of like, a journalism horror story. It's usually not funny at all.
Yeah. I mean, in retrospect, it's like, okay, well, whatever. But at the time, you just remember being young, and you remember being so eager and wanting to do a good job, and just being so pissed off that you let yourself down like that.
Right, yeah. And then what is your favorite film, book, TV, or other media property about journalists, and why?
I love this question. We've been threatening on the press box to do a journalism movie power ranking to put them all in order. So I'll give you 1.5. The half is that when I did that internship at Nightline that I mentioned, I came back home and I rented broadcast news, and I was like, oh my God, that is television news. Like, I had just seen it for real. And then I saw that movie, the tension between entertainment and news and everything. It was so well done. But I think the one that I love the most is the Humphrey Bogart movie, Deadline USA from 1952. Have you seen this movie?
No.
Okay. Humphrey Bogart is a newspaper editor of a newspaper called The Day, which is kind of a butt-kicking daily, obviously daily. Mm-hmm. He is, two things are happening. One, the newspaper is going out of business. And the second thing is he is trying to investigate this gangster who is kind of controlling the city he's in. I think it vaguely New York, but I'm not sure New York is actually mentioned in the movie. Mm-hmm. It is a fabulous movie for a couple of different reasons. One is the newsroom that they constructed at night is actually a very, very realistic newsroom. I'm sure you've seen movies where it's like, here's the newsroom, and you look at it like, that doesn't look like any place I've ever worked. The people don't talk like journalists, everything. This movie, it's almost like they parachuted into the New York Daily News in 1952 and just filmed the newsroom. It's pretty incredible. It is kind of a little bit of a melodrama, but also the stuff the reporters actually go out and do resembles the kind of thing reporters would do in real life. You know, I feel like every journalism movie we get, it's like Russell Crowe being shot at or something when he's reporting. Yeah. That is not going to happen domestically anyway, right? All that many times in someone's career. They're not going to be unraveling the mother of all conspiracies and things like that. This is just reporting on a gangster. I think one of the journalists gets roughed up, but otherwise, anyway, it's black and white. It's really cool. I would highly, highly recommend Deadline USA if people have never seen it.
Yeah, those are two great answers. I've seen broadcast news, but you're the first person to mention it. And the Bogart one, yeah, I've never heard of, so I'll have to check that out. And yeah, 2 new ones in 50 episodes. That's pretty good. I keep thinking that well is going to run dry, but it keeps running.
I'm happy. We got some new ones. That's cool.
And then the final question is, qualifications aside, if you couldn't be a journalist, what job would you do?
What job would I do? That's the hardest one for me, because I don't know if the other people you've talked to, but I can't imagine myself doing anything else. At least it's not like tangentially related.
Sure.
Right? Can I imagine myself like writing books or, teaching journals? I don't know, something like that, I guess. But I've never been able to imagine anything else.
But qualifications aside, I mean, you could be a basketball player, an astronaut, or whatever.
Oh, wait. So I have all the abilities.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, okay. I thought this was the actual Bryan. I didn't realize this was like Marvel Universe Bryan that could do anything. It was funny when I was a kid. I think I'll go to this one. When I was a kid, I just really wanted to be like, I think probably all boys want to do this. My son probably does too. But just want to be a scientist. And not not somebody in a lab doing things with beakers, but like somebody in the field pursuing snakes and the world's largest python, kind of a field biologist. Let's go with that. That still holds romance to me.
That's a good answer. Okay, cool, great. Well, that's all the questions. I think this went really well. I'm really happy we were able to talk. Is there anything you want to add before we wrap up?
No, that's it for me. Thank you. I just want to say thank you so much for having me on. This was very, very fun to talk to you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Bryan, for coming on the podcast. That's our show. Thanks for listening to my conversation with Bryan Curtis, an editor-at-large at The Ringer and the host of the Press Box podcast. I'll post links to some of the things that Bryan talked about in the podcast description and also on our show page, foreignpod.podbean.com. If you like the show, please subscribe to it in Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts, and give it a rating. Beyond that, it would be a huge help if you also write out a review saying what you think about the show. It helps get the podcast more attention. Follow or tweet at me on Twitter at foreignpod. On Facebook, our page is facebook.com/foreignpod. Above all, if you know someone who might like the podcast, please recommend it to them. The show is produced and edited by me. Our music is a track called Love Chances by Mackay Beats. There's more information on that in the podcast description and on our show page. Please look for the next episode to be posted on Sunday, August 1st. Until then, I'm Jake Spring, and this is Foreign Correspondence.